In southern Turkey, at Incirlik Air Base, the United States houses a unique asset. It is not the advanced missile defense systems, nor the squadrons of F-35s. This is something that changes the nature of every strategic calculation, in every war room, and in every capital on Earth, the moment it becomes a target. It is a stockpile. 50 to 60 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs held in hardened underground vaults, and on Wednesday, March 4th, this base and its nuclear arsenal became the target. The attack came at 03:17 Zulu time. From a launch site in Proxy territory, Iran fired a single Fateh-110 medium-range ballistic missile. This was not a stray rocket. This was a precision weapon carrying a 500-kilogram payload on a meticulously calculated trajectory over Iraq and Syria, its terminal destination programmed for a single coordinate, Incirlik Air Base. Deep in the eastern Mediterranean, aboard a NATO Aegis destroyer, the world had shrunk to the cold blue glow of a tactical display. The Iranian missile appeared as a hostile track file, a silent, menacing arc climbing towards Turkish airspace. There was no debate, no political consultation. The protocols were absolute. A calm, steady voice cut through the low hum of the Combat Information Center. Track file designated Sierra Victor 1. Threat axis confirmed. Weapon A engagement authorized. The seconds stretched. On screen, a second symbol ignited. The interceptor launched from the ship's vertical cells, accelerating to meet the threat. It was a purely mathematical equation, playing out at hypersonic speeds. Then, a new symbol bloomed on the screen, a small sterile starburst where the two paths converged. A new voice, just as calm as the first, confirmed the outcome. Splash. Confirmed kill. Track Sierra Victor 1 no longer exists. A single missile had been destroyed. The nuclear hostages at Incirlik were, for the moment, safe. But a threshold had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. For the first time in its 77-year history, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had fired in combat to defend a member state. A guardrail, long considered theoretical, had just been tested and shattered in real time. When a systemic guardrail like the credibility of NATO's nuclear sharing agreement shatters, the first-order response is never kinetic. It is narrative control. And so, within hours, it emerged. From Turkish officials, a weak, contradictory statement was fed to the press. The missile, they suggested, was likely aimed at Cyprus. It simply veered off course. Let's be clinical. A Shahab 3 class liquid-fueled missile launched from western Iran is not a random firework. Its guidance system is designed for a specific circular error probable. After a 1,200-kilometer ballistic arc across the sovereign airspace of Iraq and Syria, it doesn't just veer at the terminal stage. The claim is a deliberate insult to physics. The interception geometry, however, is a direct confession. A launch profile targeting Cyprus requires a bearing of roughly 245 degrees. The observed trajectory was closer to 265, a direct line to Incirlik. That is precisely the target profile a forward-deployed Aegis destroyer in the eastern Mediterranean is positioned to counter. The system engaged with an SM-3 interceptor for a mid-course kill, at the exact altitude and vector predicted for an Incirlik-bound threat. The official narrative was therefore a fiction, designed to firewall markets from panic. But in choosing it, Western leaders revealed a dangerously low willingness to escalate. For Tehran, this is not a gesture of de-escalation, it is actionable intelligence. It proves that the deterrent threshold is soft, and the perceived cost for the next probe has just been significantly marked down. But this fiction served a second, more critical function. It was a smokescreen, not just for public consumption, but to buy operational time. Because while the media debated the physics of a stray missile, behind that curtain, emergency consultations were being initiated within NATO's nuclear planning group, and retaliatory strike packages were being spooled up. A very different clock had just been started. Was a smokescreen. Because while the world's media debated the physics of a stray missile, in the shadows, a far more dangerous clock had just started ticking. That clock wasn't ticking in Brussels or Washington, D.C. Its mechanism was turning thousands of miles away in the cold, dark depths of the Indian Ocean near the coast of Sri Lanka. Down there, in the silent pressurized steel hull of a Virginia-class submarine, the environment was not one of panic, but of cold procedure. The soft glow of sonar displays, the low hum of life support, the measured quiet commands of the fire control officer. This was a place of work, and their work was to kill. On the surface, bathed in the tropical sun, was the IRIS Dena, one of Iran's most modern merge-class frigates. A target. The order was given. A single Mk-48 torpedo was launched. There was no warning shot. This was not a message, it was a sentence. The impact was catastrophic. A geyser of water, metal and fire erupted from the Dena's midsection. The ship broke apart with brutal speed. Its back broken, its systems dead. It slipped beneath the waves in under 2 minutes, leaving only debris and a spreading fuel slick. Its 80 dead sailors distributed across the Indian Ocean. This was not just another skirmish. This was a threshold event. For the first time since August 14, 1945, when the USS Torsk sank a Japanese vessel, a United States submarine had just executed a confirmed torpedo sinking of an enemy warship. An 80-year precedent of naval warfare had just been shattered in complete silence, far from any camera. The conflict was no longer contained to the skies over Turkey. It was now a multi-domain shadow war being fought across the globe. A kill order had been executed, a strategic point scored in the dark. But back in the light, the paper shield of the NATO alliance was about to be tested by an entirely different kind of pressure. The question was no longer about deflecting missiles, but about maintaining a fracturing political will. An attack on one is an attack on all. For over 70 years, that has been the bedrock promise of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a simple, powerful deterrent. And in the wake of the Incirlik attack, the world waited for that promise to be honored. They would be disappointed. The first signal came not from Brussels, but from Washington, D.C. In a press gaggle on the Pentagon steps, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was asked the obvious question. His response was brutally clear. Quote, "There's no sense that it would trigger anything like Article 5. He didn't hesitate. It wasn't a consideration. It was a dismissal. A deliberate move to cap escalation, yes. But it broadcast a message of profound weakness across the globe. The line had been crossed, and the world's sole superpower had publicly flinched. Then came the official statement from NATO headquarters. Secretary-General Mark Rutte stood at the podium, his face grim. He condemned the attack as, quote, unacceptable. He stated that NATO stands firmly with Turkey. Let us translate this from diplomat speak. Unacceptable means it already happened. Stands firmly means we will do nothing. Notice the words he did not say, NATO will act. NATO activates Article 5. The distance between standing firmly and acting is the gap between rhetoric and operational reality. It is a chasm. This is not incompetence. This is the system functioning as designed. As analysis from both the RAND Corporation and Harvard's Belfer Center has confirmed for decades, Article 5 is deliberately ambiguous. Invoking it requires absolute geopolitical consensus. A consensus that is designed to evaporate under the pressure of hybrid attacks and calculated, deniable escalations. This is the playbook. The final proof came from Ankara. Turkey, the nation attacked, the host of the nuclear weapons, sidestepped the alliance framework entirely. Their statement declared they would respond under international law. They were on their own, and they knew it. The paper shield had been held up to the fire, and it was burning. The map isn't just being redrawn, the ink is dissolving. But the talking heads on financial television will call this political noise. They will miss the signal. For those of us who track capital flows instead of headlines, this isn't noise. It's an announcement. It's an announcement that the fundamental risk models underpinning Western markets are about to break. And when they do, the real damage begins. That damage begins not with a declaration of war, but with the silent, brutal repricing of reality. While politicians offer statements, markets react to operational facts. And the fact is, a threshold was breached. This was not Crimea or a Syrian skirmish. Those tested regional tripwires. This attack targeted a nuclear-sharing NATO base, proving the core guardrail of the entire post-Cold War order vulnerable. That is a systemic risk event. Financial models had assumed was a zero probability tail event. Standard risk parity portfolios and VAR calculations are not built for a world where the nuclear guarantee itself is in question. Their correlation matrices just broke. The immediate effect is mechanical. Brent crude oil futures spike between 7 and 13%, surging past $82 a barrel. For a nation like Turkey, that is an immediate crisis. Sustained prices at this level widen its current account deficit by an estimated $18 billion. That is not a statistic. That is a 1% GDP hole that puts crushing pressure on the lira and sends its sovereign debt costs spiraling. A sudden energy shock of this magnitude doesn't just get passed on to consumers. It instantly vaporizes the margins of logistics firms whose fuel costs can exceed 30% of operations, creating physical bottlenecks in the world's supply chain. This is a forward-looking inflation shock, forcing a central bank reaction. But oil was just the shockwave. The tremor that sent the systematic funds, the risk parity models, and the CTAs running for hardened shelters came from the price of gold. As capital executes a mass flight from fiat, gold doesn't just rise, it gaps up, surging to a new record, over $5,300 an ounce. A price like that isn't just a flight to safety. It's a vote of no confidence in the sovereign debt of nations whose security guarantees just proved worthless. Then, the liquidation cascade. Risk assets are not sold off randomly. The ambiguity of the Article 5 response directly reprices sovereign risk for frontline NATO states, triggering mandated selling of their bonds and equities, financials and industrials first. The Dow falls over 400 points at the open. The S&P 500 drops between 1 and 2% as European and Asian indices follow in a contagion of logic, not fear. This isn't speculation. The spike in energy, the flight to hard assets, and the dumping of European-linked equities is the coherent, immediate repricing of a security architecture that has just been invalidated. Here is the transmission mechanism, made plain. Article 5 ambiguity devalues the NATO guarantee. That immediately adds a risk premium to the sovereign debt of member states. Higher sovereign yields mean higher borrowing costs for every corporation in those countries, crushing valuations and forcing portfolio managers to liquidate. The official story is fantasy. The markets are reacting to this operational reality, and while Western capital scrambles to reprice this one tested threshold. The architects of this chaos are not panicking. They are calmly executing the next phase of their strategy, consolidating gains while their opponents are distracted by the fire. While Western markets speculate on the next threshold after Incirlik, our adversaries are not speculating. They are consolidating power. Any hope that this crisis might exhaust itself through some internal reform in Tehran has been surgically removed. The Assembly of Experts did convene following the Supreme Leader's death, but this was pure political theatre. The decision was predetermined not in the Assembly, but by the security apparatus that controls it. The IRGC's influence over the Guardian Council had already filtered the candidate list, ensuring only a loyalist could proceed. This is how they checkmate diplomacy, not with a single move, but by controlling the entire board before the game even begins. The result is Mojtaba Khamenei, not a reformer, not a moderate. He is the late leader's son, a man whose entire career is a product of the IRGC's most opaque and powerful directorates, specifically his well-documented role within the IRGC intelligence organization and his function as a key architect of the 2009 Green Movement suppression. He is the IRGC's institutional guarantee, the one candidate who ensures their doctrine, budget, and power remain untouchable. This outcome was a strategic certainty, a conclusion obvious to anyone who ignores the fantasy of a moderate pivot. A fantasy that was demonstrably false during the JCPOA negotiations and every election cycle since. The system is not designed to produce reformers when it perceives a threat to its existence. It is designed to produce men like Mojtaba. His succession locks in policy for a generation. This is not a temporary escalation. It is the codification of a permanent state of confrontation. It means the nuclear breakout timeline is no longer a variable, but a fixed objective. It means the proxy network, from the Houthis to Hezbollah, is now a permanent fixture of statecraft, not a bargaining chip. And it means the strategic axis, with Moscow and Beijing, is now a structural reality. For capital markets, this removes all ambiguity. The risk premium on every barrel of oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz is now permanent. Any model assuming a future rollback of sanctions must be discarded. And the defense budgets of every Gulf state, of Israel, and of NATO itself are now set on an unalterable upward trajectory. The map is being redrawn in real time, and the ink is blood and capital. So, the map is redrawn. The diplomatic off-ramps are permanently closed. A new hardline regime is consolidating power in Tehran. This creates a strategic vacuum. The question on every terminal in the Pentagon and Langley is no longer, how do we de-escalate? But what is the doctrinal response when deterrence has already failed? The answer arrived not in a presidential address, but in a quiet wire alert from Reuters, time-stamped 1642 Zulu. Washington is in direct negotiations with Kurdish commanders in Syria. The objective: to open a new, chaotic ground front against Iran through a proxy force. Make no mistake, this is not a display of strength. This is a symptom of strategic bankruptcy. This is the contingency plan you drag from the bottom drawer when the primary systems, alliances, deterrence, Article 5 itself, have shattered. To understand the profound cynicism of this move, you don't need a security clearance. You only need a history book. This isn't a new plan. It's a very old and very dark playbook. In 1991, Washington encouraged this same group to rise up against Saddam Hussein. They did. And as Saddam's helicopters conducted massacres, the US stood by and did nothing. This pattern of encouragement, followed by abandonment, was seen in 1975 and again in 2019. So when the White House signals it is activating this asset again, it's spending the last vestiges of its own credibility on a gamble it has historically refused to back. But this desperate tactical play is a symptom of a much larger, more terrifying dynamic. A pattern that has been playing out over these past 24 hours, which has only one true historical precedent. We are not just watching a regional conflict spiral. We are watching a live fire reenactment of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. John F. Kennedy's greatest fear wasn't simply the existence of the missiles. It was reaching the point where his only options left were, in his own words, humiliation or an all-out nuclear war. A choice which he knew would leave only the taste of ashes in our mouths. To understand that choice, you must place yourself in the White House Cabinet Room in October 1962. Spread across the table is not just maps, but fresh U-2 reconnaissance imagery confirming Soviet R-12 nuclear missile sites in Cuba. Drafts of strike orders are already prepared. For President Kennedy's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the calculation was brutally simple. Execute immediate airstrikes, followed by a full-scale invasion. They accepted the probability of a Soviet nuclear response as a necessary cost of demonstrating resolve. Then came Black Saturday, when the guardrails of command and control disintegrated. A U-2 was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet SA-2 missile, an action taken without direct orders from Moscow. Far below the waves, the Soviet submarine B-59, cut off from all communication and harassed by US destroyers dropping practice depth charges, believed war had begun. Its captain prepared to launch a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Confronted with this cascade, Kennedy was no longer weighing abstract risks. He was staring at the mechanics of an uncontrolled slide into annihilation. He was surrounded by advisors demanding he authorize the strikes. Yet his own calculus was different. He was weighing the certainty of their plan against the gaps in intelligence, the unknown Soviet protocols for retaliation, and the 100 million American casualties projected in a full exchange. It was in that moment of strategic isolation that he articulated the real stakes. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the costs of worldwide nuclear war in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. What the public never knew was the secret back channel that pulled the world back from that threshold. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the United States would quietly, months later, remove its 15 Jupiter medium-range ballistic missiles from Turkey. A strategically provocative, if increasingly obsolete, deployment to a key NATO ally. This is not a historical footnote. It is the direct precedent for the Iranian missile strike on Incirlik Air Base unfolding right now. The 15 Jupiter missiles in Turkey in 1962 find their direct structural equivalent in the estimated 50 B-61 tactical nuclear bombs currently stored there under NATO's nuclear sharing agreement. Once again, a missile threat tests alliance commitments on the exact same geography. This is the recurring pattern. A weapons posture intended as a deterrent becomes a flashpoint that creates an impossible choice between abandoning a treaty ally or initiating an escalatory exchange. This is the unpriced risk now sitting squarely on the table.